our first speaker was supposed to be Dr. Asif Bayat, but he's a little bit late in arriving, so we switched the keynotes, and our first speaker will be Dr. Rashid Holiday, whom I'll introduce in a minute. So this is Dr. Rashid Holiday. This is not Asif Bayat. Just a few words about the choice of the specific themes of the conference. As the steering committee noted in the concept note, durable authoritarianism in the Arab world has been shaken by political revolutions across the region. While the outbreak of mass protest movements was seemingly sudden, these mass movements reflect longer histories of civil society mobilizations. The existence of older and more conventional kinds of institutions such as labor unions, political parties, and social welfare organizations was critical to adding discipline, legitimacy, and history of activism into the mix of spontaneous protests. So one of the themes this conference would like to interrogate is the role of older forms and institutions, but also to examine new actors and spaces produced by the ongoing revolts. These mass protests were animated above all by demands for political and civil rights, respect and dignity, and opposition to corruption and economic exploitation. The underlying and unifying sentiment of these protests was a demand for state reform and for more robust means of civic engagement and participation. Even in countries where there have been regime changes, the struggles continue because people's demands and expectations have yet to be satisfied. So the objective of this conference is to air and analyze how changes over the last 2 years are reconfiguring the boundaries of state and society and the meaning of citizenship. How conceptions of citizenship are being formulated and reformulated in terms of rights, claims, and the politics of inclusion and exclusion. How constitutions in particular and the law in general have constituted terrains of struggle. How alliances and/or conflicts are framed through and mobilized around gender, sexuality, generation, class, rural-urban divides, and communitarian and sectarian identities. How popular culture and social media have contributed to and reflected collective mobilizations. How protests have been affected by war, militarization, and securitization, including in some places counter-revolutionary repression. And how the protests have produced various kinds of regional and transnational interferences, as well as solidarities across borders. These are some of the themes that we laid to our participants that we hope to begin to interrogate and discuss in this panel. So with this, I will now very quickly introduce our first keynote speaker, Dr. Rashid Holiday. Dr. Rashid Holiday is the Edward Said Professor of Arab Studies in the Department of History at Columbia University. He has taught at the Lebanese University, the American University of Beirut. He was my teacher, by the way. Although he looks younger than I do. But
don't blame me. One course.
Georgetown University and the University of Chicago. He is past president of the Middle East Studies Association, served as an advisor to the Palestinian delegation to the 1991-93 Arab-Israeli peace negotiations, and is the editor of the Journal of Palestine Studies. His academic publications include Brokers of Deceit, the most recent book, How the U.S. has undermined peace in the Middle East. It just came out a couple of months ago. Sowing Crisis, American Dominance and the Cold War in the Middle East came out in 2009. The Iron Cage, The Story of Palestinian Struggle for Statehood, it came out in 2006, and many others. Without further ado, please welcome Professor Rashid Holiday.
Thank you, Ahmed. Is this working?
Yes.
Now it's working. Thank you, Ahmed. I feel like I sometimes do at the beginning of a class. If you came here for Asif Bayat, this is the wrong classroom. I'm a last-minute fill-in, in fact. I have been on the road for a number of days. Our classes finished just before a series of meetings that I have to come to every 6 months in Beirut and in Amman. And I was assuming I had the luxury of another day to prepare my keynote. When last night, Lisa, told me last night that I had to speak at 9 a.m. this morning. So if I'm more than usually, if I'm more incoherent than usual, it's because I had to do that plus deal with a letter from my chair about a difficult tenure case at 2 in the morning. So I'm going to talk about the topic that I was asked by Lisa Hajjar to address, which is geopolitical factors which affect civic participation in struggles for social justice in the Arab world. That's her email to me. So what I'm going to be saying, I hope you'll just see as framing our discussions of the next 2 days. It's in my view, peripheral, but I think it might be useful to understanding some of the problems that any effort to change the status quo in the Arab world face. There are many factors, both within and outside the Arab world, geopolitical factors, that I think limit or otherwise affect the struggle for social justice and the struggle for more equitable political forms. Most of these factors are entirely negative. I was able to think of one that is positive. I can only talk about a few of them in the 30 minutes that I have this morning. And I'm going to focus on 3 of them. The first is the role of the Arab Petrol monarchies. The second is the support of Western countries and the United States in particular for these Petrol monarchies and their values and policies. The third is the issue of Israel. And the fourth, and this is the only positive factor, I'll get to at the end. It's a little more complicated. And I think we have to start with the extraordinary, and I think this is by far the most important limitation on struggles in the Arab world. And it is the extraordinarily active role of the fabulously wealthy Arab Petrol monarchies. And I see them as operating on 3 levels. The first level is their role in opposing any form of democracy and social justice in defense of their core values. And the core values of these systems are absolute monarchy, tribalism, entrenched social inequality, and a defense of social inequality, and hereditary rights. In other words, their core values are antithetical to social justice and an equitable political system. So that's the first value. The second is their role in spreading corrosive sectarianism in the Arab Mashriq in particular. This affects the Maghreb, Egypt and the Maghreb less, but in a country with no Shia like Egypt, you actually are beginning to see absolutely ludicrous instigation of sectarian values. It's astonishing, but it is a particular problem for the Arab Mashriq. The third level on which they operate has to do with their support of, I guess they can be called neo-Salafi doctrines, post-Salafi doctrines, which elevate a perverse understanding of what is called by these people Sharia, and a perverse understanding of what is called by these people Islam, over any kind of normative law, over the borders of the existing states, on the authority of these existing states, over civic politics, over any form of democracy. In fact, a rejection of the values that the entire society of the entire region have been more or less adapting to over 200 years. And these followers of these doctrines are trying to impose a unique, and I think unique in modern history, an arbitrary form of radical tyranny, which the only thing I can think of in the 20th and 21st century that is even close to what these folks seem to have in mind is the Pol Pot regime in Cambodia. Absolutely revolutionary regime which destroyed everything, every possible structure of society and law and governance. Now, the problem is that these are not just values and these are not just actions of the governments of the Petrol monarchies. They are the actions that can be taken by major branches or major individuals from the royal and princely families and from the plutocracy with which these families are intermarried. I don't need to name the families, that they're all related to one another. Within these societies, these amount to scores, maybe hundreds of individual multi-billionaires, hundreds of multi-billionaires, dozens, hundreds, scores, nobody knows. I mean, I don't think a proper count has been made. All of whom are above the law in their own state. A member of the royal family in one of these petromonarchies is not subject to any law. He's not even subject necessarily, or she, in many cases, to family control. There is no control over them. They're like radical ions. They can go anywhere and they can do anything. And they're multi-billionaires. Many of them are not involved in politics, thank God. But many of them have, in effect, their own foreign policy. And they have disposable income, which is equal to the foreign aid budget of small-sized states like Britain or France or Germany. And this is not the state we're talking about. This is Amir Fulan al-Altani ibn Fulan al-Altani. Personally, could have a budget of $20 billion, $10 billion, which he or his sister or his uncle can spend on whichever newspaper, television station, whatever he or she wants to be involved with. So that's the first geopolitical factor that efforts to change the status quo have to deal with. The second geopolitical factor is the unlimited support of the West in general and of the United States in particular, not so much for specific regimes as for these petromonarchies and the system that they need in order to continue to exist. Now, why is this so important? You have to look at the fact that before the United States became a global power, in 1933, it developed an alliance with one of these states, with Saudi Arabia, which, in fact, is far older, much deeper, and much more integral to the American economy and to U.S. global strategic domination than its alliances with any other Middle Eastern power, including Turkey, which is a NATO member, including the Shah of Iran when he was a major pillar of American strategy, and including Israel. For all of the noise that's made about the American-Israeli connection, this is a much more important connection in terms of base structural elements of the American economy and of American strategic interests. And what this means is that the West and the United States, irrespective of what they may feel about democracy or social justice, are obliged to at least pay attention to the values and policies of these petromonarchies in their dealings with the rest of the region. Now, these monarchies, it is sometimes suggested, are vital because of energy. Of course they're important because of energy, there's no question about that. But in fact, the privileged Western relation with the countries that sit on the world's largest reserves of energy and which are the world's swing producers of oil is important also because it provides essential advantages to the central pillars of the Western economies, of the capitalist economy, of the world economy: finance, aerospace, defense, heavy industry, real estate, luxury. French economy depends in part on real estate and luxury goods. You take Cartier out, you take the Champs-Élysées out of the French economy, and an important dynamic element of the French economy goes. You take Boeing or General Dynamics or Lockheed Martin or Daimler-Benz or Citibank or Morgan Stanley out of the American economy or the French or the, name your Western economy, and you have problems. And it is that connection which I think has to be seen as at least as important as the energy connection. And of course it's linked. It's therefore not just the governments of the Western countries which see the preservation of the status quo in the Arab world that these petromonarchies have dominated since the 1970s as important. It is also a vital necessity for the most powerful economic interests in all of these countries. And I don't know if you followed the banking crisis in the United States, but you may have noticed that all of the popular fury at the destruction of a huge segment of American wealth and of the living standards of millions of Americans has not led to a change in the influence of the banks on our economy. They are as they were before. Things were done as they wanted. They get their bonuses, they got bailouts, and we can't tell them, we the citizens, we the taxpayers, we the government, cannot tell them what to do. The idea that these economic interests are not important and that we should just look at voting and lobbies and so on and so forth is unfortunately, I think, a little bit naive. At the very least, these interests tell politicians what are the limits of what they can and cannot do. And changing a status quo from which they benefit very significantly in this part of the world is something that I think is considered a red line by these interests. So the real question is not whether this or that American or French politician, an Obama, a Merkel, a Hollande, would prefer a little more social justice in Egypt or Tunisia, or would like to see a slightly better simulacrum of democracy in Yemen or Syria. It is neither. It is rather what are the lines that are laid down for these politicians by what are portrayed in the media, at least, as national interests or strategic interests of their countries, but are really the bottom line of Boeing or Airbus or Citibank or General Dynamics or Lockheed Martin. You may think I exaggerate. In 2011, the top 5 U.S. defense contractors produced $135 billion in sales. $66 billion of those sales were in weapons. That's to say, companies that produce many things these 5 companies produced $66 billion in weapons. Their profits were $13 billion in 2011. They employed 500,000 people. 500,000 people paid as highly as workers are paid anywhere in the world. These are influential voters. These are influential stockholders. These are very, very influential companies. More than half of those arms sales were to the Petrol Monarchies. This is a central, crucial sector, one of the few sectors in which the American economy has an absolute advantage over the entire world defense. Half of their sales were to these countries. If you think these countries are not important to the United States, you're not looking at the same world I'm looking at. They are very important. And I think you could say the same thing for finance. You could say the same thing for many other sectors, aerospace, and so on and so forth. So what the Gulf petromonarchies want in this region, absolutism, sectarianism, no legal limits on their rule, is what these companies need for their bottom line. Let me talk now briefly about Israel. Those of us like myself who have had the unfortunate experience of living within range of the long reach of the Israel Defense Forces. I lived in Beirut during the 1982 war and before and after, and so I know whereof I speak. Those of us who've had this unfortunate experience have understandably developed a somewhat exaggerated impression of the role of Israel in this region. Of course, the impact of Israel has been overwhelming for the Palestinian people, and it's been enormous for Lebanon, and it's been quite significant for every one of the countries bordering on Palestine, for Jordan, for Syria, for Egypt, and of course for other Middle Eastern countries. Nevertheless, in addressing the impact of Israel, of the Israeli factor on the struggle for social justice in the Arab world, I would argue that it is not as great by any means as the 2 factors I've talked about, considerably less important, and that it is both negative and positive. It's obviously negative, and this is mainly because Israel is tacitly and covertly aligned with the Arab petromonarchies in encouraging sectarianism, in encouraging weakness of the existing states, which are rivals to the petromonarchies and which are rivals, obviously, to Israel. Israel is also aligned with these petromonarchies in their effort to prevent any regional state from being able to rival them strategically, and this is the focus of all of them vis-a-vis Iran, obviously. But in fact, I would argue that Israel is a marginal player, insofar as the struggle for social justice and more equitable political forms are concerned. with the possible exceptions of, certainly the exception of Palestine and the partial exception of Lebanon, by comparison with the Gulf. These are the heavy hitters in this department. These are the people with the deepest pockets. These are the people with by far the strongest interests in the preservation of the status quo. And these are the people with the deepest reservoirs of sectarian prejudice. And that's what's driving their policies. And that's why they're having the impact that they're having on the Arab world. On the positive side, this may sound peculiar coming from me, but on the positive side, Israel actually sometimes serves as a unifying factor for popular trends in the Arab world. That's true even though it's very difficult to determine how to confront Israel. This is a perplexing challenge that's not easy to meet, and it hasn't been easy since the beginning of the conflict with Zionism 100 years ago. This is particularly the case because it's difficult to decide how to meet this challenge and at the same time meet the challenges of social justice and developing equitable political systems. And it's the Palestinians are caught in this right now. How do you deal with completely dysfunctional political systems largely imposed on the Palestinians and at the same time deal with occupation, a system that's linked to occupation? Which way do you face? So those are the three negative factors, mainly negative factors I wanted to talk about. The last factor I want to talk about, it's not really a geopolitical one, but I think it is an international one, or it's at least a transnational one. And this is the sense of global solidarity, of connectedness to struggles elsewhere, and of the ability to appeal over the heads of Arab governments that were tied to repressive Arab regimes that people in the region seem to have felt over the last 2.5 years. The sense that you could appeal over the heads of the unresponsive Western governments supporting the repressive regimes to sectors of the population in Western and other countries that are potentially sympathetic. I sense this from outside the region most of the time, since the beginning of the uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt and Yemen and so forth. You could see it in the slogans. I mean, the very fact that some slogans were produced in English means that there was an understanding that there was a world out there, and that world out there would have an impact on Mubarak or Ben Ali or whichever other tyrant you want to choose. And I think it did, in fact. Now, this sense that the world is watching, this sense that what's happening in this region is a world historical event, is actually not historically unique. It's not the first time that the world has experienced this sort of global euphoria over the fate meted out to tyrants. Remember the French Revolution. Remember what bliss it was in that dawn to be alive. I mean, in England, in English, people were talking about the French Revolution. And in San Francisco and in Beijing and all over the world, people were talking about what was happening in Tahrir and in Tunis and in Yemen. Same thing happened in 1848. It was a world historical moment. The same thing happened in 1917. And this is, on balance, a positive factor. How it can be used, to what extent it can be sustained is another question. And in this sense, it's not an unmitigated plus. Attention spans can be short. People can be fickle. Lack of knowledge is devastating, and most people outside this region, most of the things they think they know are wrong about the Arab world, outside the Arab world, especially in the United States. And the mainstream media can be manipulated. I need not give you chapter and verse. I want to conclude by saying that I've started by talking about something that I think should not be central to our discussions. I'm just trying to give you what I think are framing ideas about the geopolitical factors that may influence things. But I think we should never accept the idea that the population of the Arab world is no more than a passive recipient of impulses from without. This is the most penetrated region on Earth and has been for the last 2 centuries because it's so important strategically and since the turn of the 20th century because of oil. It is so important to others that others put their noses into the business of this region, not just the Arab world, but the entire region, Turkey, Iran as well. Nevertheless, as the upheavals of the past 30 months or so have shown, And as earlier upheavals in this region showed, it is very hard to control this region from without. And in spite of external influences or regional influences from the Petrol monarchies in favor of maintaining the status quo, the population of this region has shown its ability to rise up against those in presidential palaces, from Tunis and Cairo to Sana'a and Tripoli. We will see what happens in Damascus. But we will also see, and I think this is very important, and this is maybe where things will tip one way or another, we will see whether royal palaces are any different than presidential palaces. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rashid. I'm actually glad we had this.
Yeah.
We'll now open the floor to questions, comments.
I'm tempted to start with a question. I spoke to final mark after the delegates on the course. But more seriously, I want to pick up one of your frames, the role of religious ideology, the religious movements, of Salafism specifically. And I mean, this is something I'm hoping to work on myself. And it seems to me that Salafism as a movement, it's not new, but in the form of current parties that are emerging in Tunisia and Egypt, in Syria and militias, etc. First of all, Salafism is extremely diverse in almost every sense. But what I think is particularly significant is that it seems to have a lot of traction among social forces, partly the underclass, which accounts for, let's say, 40% of the population in places like Egypt or Jordan or Syria, which were not part of the old binary politics of authoritarian periods, in which you either had, say, the ruling party, the NDP in Egypt, or the Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood, or maybe communist parties. Most of the political parties we know, including so-called liberals that we now see operating in Egypt or Tunisia, trying to create a new party politics, were all formed in the authoritarian era and sort of were formed in that political context. There are, to my mind, only two very broad, very loosely defined social sectors that weren't part of that system, weren't formed in it in the same way, and that's youth, and what that really means politically is very vague, of course, and the underclass, which sort of left the formal economy and left formal politics and is now partly reflected, not exclusively, in the form of Salafism. What this suggests to me then, if we're looking for a new kind of politics in the Arab world, the external factors are important. But in terms of social transformation producing new types of politics, then these are two key sectors where there may be a new kind of politics. And the performance of, say, the Noor party or other parties in Egypt this is an example, there are similar parties in Yemen. And I guess what I'm putting to you is a question, and this again brings the focus more down to sort of the bottom-up rather than the top-down approach, which is, are there areas where there's maybe common ground in what you might regard as a secular or liberal agenda in terms of establishing a new ethics of politics, of people tolerating each other, allowing genuine pluralism, which I see reflected in the discourse of some of the Salafists, ironically. And so whether in fact it's really also for seculars and liberals to seek very actively alliances with people who it's too easy to sort of put aside in a box and say you're all horrible medieval types.
I should have made myself clear, because I actually think what we're now seeing is stratification or differentiation, which is really quite amazing and quite rapid. And I was not so much talking about Salafism and projects like Hizb al-Nur in Egypt. I'm talking about what you might call post-neo-Salafism. The people I'm talking about would cause the likes of Rashid Holiday and Ghani and Abdu to turn in their graves. Because I'm talking about people who fundamentally reject the nation state, fundamentally reject a whole series of agreed upon structures. الدولة الإسلامية في العراق بلاد الشام don't accept Sykes-Picot, but they not only don't accept Sykes-Picot, they don't accept the structures of governance. Whereas Hezbollah Noor is sending people to public administration schools to learn how to run the Egyptian state. So I'm not actually, what I was referring to here was post-neo-Salaf, whatever you want to call it. I don't want to use the terms that are used in the West. I don't know what they are. This to me is a quite radical solvent. Whereas I think that the way in which Salafism is developing, mainstream Salafism, if we can call it that, in the form of Hezbollah Noor, is a completely different kettle of fish. And the question you've asked, I think, is going to be determined on a country-by-country basis, actually. I don't think that there are some regional factors, and there are some external factors, but I actually think the specificity of each individual Arab country is going to determine the answer to your question. I mean, I'm not a student up close, as most people in this room or living here are, of specific cases, but my sense from the 2 or 3 cases that I have some little knowledge of is that you may see some remarkable changes. I mean, you may see alliances of the people with no beards with the people with short beards against the people with long beards, or alliances of the people with long beards and the people with no beards against the people with short beards. And it'll have nothing to do with ideology. It'll have to do with politics. And at that point, you will be talking not about values and religion and so on and so forth. You'll be talking about control of the security apparatus and how the administration is run, and are we going to be neoliberals, or are we going to do something to develop the society? We'll see how that develops.
Thank you, Rashid. Among the factors that you mentioned were some new ones and some very old ones. So what is your analysis of the development now with Russia and China playing much more significant roles, some of them openly, some of them quietly? How do they fit into this broader geostrategic picture?
Yeah. I probably should have talked about Russia. And we will be talking at the next conference, or the one after it, about China. China is going to become more energy dependent, and China's economy is going to become more dependent on the recycling of petrobillions. And as that becomes the case, we're going to see changes. Russia's an important player, particularly important today in Syria and generally in the region. But in terms of interests, I have to say, Russia as a major energy exporter is just not in the same position as the Western countries. And Russia is a minor exporter, for example, of weaponry. By comparison, I was looking at the CIPRI figures last night, $4, $5, $8 billion. Peanuts, on the level of Israel or Italy. It's not really a major arms exporter by comparison. It's important here because we buy, this region has traditionally bought a lot of Soviet Russian weapons. So Russia is a big factor in particular. But I would argue that in terms of the constraints on tendencies that would change the status quo, Russia is playing a role in the case of Syria, for example. But I don't think it has anything like the same influence as the Petrol Monarchies or the United States in the West generally.
سؤال دكتور رشيد، إلى أي درجة تعتقد أن التناقض الناشئ ما بين القيم الديمقراطية في الغرب وأمريكا الحديثة بالجهة وسياستها الداعمة للملكيات ومعادلة الديمقراطية بالجهة الأخرى، إلى أي درجة يمكن لهذا التناقض أن يؤدي إلى تحفيز ديناميكية تؤدي إلى تغيير موقفها؟
أولاً، لم تكن الولايات المتحدة في أي فترة منذ ظهورها كقوة عالمية داعمة للديمقراطية في منطقتنا. لم تكن أبداً من دعاة الديمقراطية عملياً على الأرض في هذه المنطقة. الانقلاب في إيران في 53، دعم الدكتاتورية في تركيا، دعم أنظمة طاغية من المحيط للخليج، يعني فالقيم الأمريكية والسياسات الأمريكية أمرين مختلفين، يعني يعني شيء بديهي. إنما بإمكان الأمريكان، الشعب الأمريكي الذي يأمن بهذه القيم الديمقراطية طبعا، أن يدخل على الخط بما معناه في إثناء أزمات. وهذا اللي حصل مع بداية الثورات العربية في الأواخر 2010 وبداية 2011. لأول مرة نرى على شاشات التلفزيون ما يحصل يوميا في عواصم عربية، وكان له تأثير هائل على الرأي العام الأمريكي. والرأي العام الأمريكي أثر لفترة قصيرة على صانعي القرار. طبعا المصالح دائمة وثابتة، والاهتمام الجمهور عابر، فلا أتوقع تأثير مستمر ودائم من هذا الرأي العام الذي يأمن بالقيم الديمقراطية في المستقبل.
When I read online that Qatar Foundation was one of the sponsors of this conference, I expected a different speech. Yeah, when I read online that Qatar Foundation was one of the sponsors of this conference, frankly, this one, it was what I read online on the AUB.
One of the speakers is a fellow at Qatar.
Right. So I applaud your courageous views anyway. Dr. Khalidi, the result of the Arab Spring, some may argue, one of the results is the downfall of the slogan, Islam is the solution. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, good question. I wasn't supposed to be the first speaker. Somebody missed a connection. You're stuck with me, and that wasn't what was planned. But that's a good question. Al-Islam huwa al-hal was a brilliant slogan for a party in opposition, and for a party that came to constitute the main opposition to awful regimes. And it worked like a charm, as they say. It brought together people who didn't necessarily agree. It didn't oblige the people who used it as a slogan to put forward any kind of policies. And it in no way constrained their actions. It has two disadvantages for a party in power. You can't say that Islam is the solution to transportation problems or to problems of housing or water or any other serious socioeconomic problem. And that's the first difficulty that slogan faces for any party that actually reaches power and is no longer in opposition. The second problem is it leaves anybody who uses the slogan open to competitors who can be more Islam huwa al-hal than they are, who can be more demagogic in the use of Islam in terms of a critique of the status quo and of the party in power. And this is what we're seeing in a number of cases where parties that have used that slogan are now being outflanked, as it were, on their right. So I think we're not going to hear it quite as much as before, perhaps.
I wanted to comment on the conversation about Salafism. I wanted to talk about Salafism. And I'd like to relate this to the fact that any social movement in the Arab world today has to take into consideration the role of women and gender equality. And yes, it's good to look at perhaps conversations and perhaps alliances taking place between Salafists with long beards, Salafists with short beards, but I think our measurement of any kind of transformations that can take place in our Arab societies has to make sure that that women's role is central to all of this. And that's something that I think we shouldn't forget when we're analyzing, being a little bit soft on certain certain ideologies which exclude half of Arab society.
Thank you, Professor. Mohammed Murshid, Georgetown University. Of the 4 factors you listed, 3 seem to be structural, systemic. 1 seems to be ideational. Unfortunately for us, it sounds like the positive factor is the ideational one. So my question then is, how successful can a revolution hope to be in a system that is structurally, systemically geared towards maintaining and reproducing the social space, the political space in the Arab world, to suit these 3 factors, which are in fact facets of U.S. imperialism, Western imperialism in the Arab world. So is it possible then to create some kind of nationalist democratic project in a space that is being configured systemically by the world order, by the capitalist economy, to suit certain interests? Given that the Petrol Monarchies, given that Israel, given also that all of these different exclusivist ideologies are in fact facets and features of this world order, is it possible to create this democratic project? Is there a space to reconfigure the balance of power when you simply have one ideational or what we call a factor of human agency confronting this system, the matrix?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. And actually there are 2, because the thing I mentioned at the end is not a geopolitical factor. It's the factor of people. I mean, it's the factor of what we're supposed to be talking about here for the next 2 days. It's the factor that civil society completely rejects these. Most of civil society in most Arab countries completely rejects all of these external attempts to dominate and control. In spite of the fact that there's confusion is sowed within the ranks of civil society, in part by the tendencies that I talked about. I think we should, I'm a historian, okay? I've told you what I think is the situation now based on my reading of how we got here. I can't tell you where we're gonna go or how we're gonna get there. That's more suited to some of the people in this room who are more involved in spheres of actually trying to change things than I am. What I can say is that I think we should pull back a little bit and avoid over-focus on the specificity of this region. Look at other regions. I mean, it's not like the United States wanted Latin American countries to move away from Pinochet-type regimes that did deals with the copper companies or South Korean regimes of the nature of Park Chung-hee's. Those things happened in spite of external factors, in spite of divisions, ethnic, regional, and so on and so forth in the case of East Asia, or Southeast Asia, or South Asia. Every other region of the globe, in fact, has seen some transition away from the kinds of models that are still in place in most Arab countries to models that are not necessarily perfect, but which are different, represent a change towards somewhat more popular participation in politics, towards somewhat more of a social safety net, if not social justice, and so on and so forth. And these may be long processes. I mean, the 1848 revolutions produced changes in values over a period of 30 or 40 years. The demands for democracy and the demands for social justice that the 1848 revolutions put forward were crushed by the Cossacks, by the Habsburg armies over a period of a couple of years. But those values eventually did take root. I think you have to step back and you have to take a little, yes, of course it's possible. Will it happen in 2013, third quarter? Probably not. But I would not underestimate the difficulty that this region presents, even though it's so important to people outside the region, in terms of controlling it. I mean, they really have had a hell of a time keeping a handle on this region. I mean, if you look at the amount of energy that the international system, so-called, that was set up by the global hegemonic powers after World War II, has spent on dealing with issues in this region. The UN Security Council spends 50% of its time on the Middle East. It means it's a region out of control. It is not running the way they want it to. I mean, yes, they're getting their profits, yes, they dominate, yes. But it's a headache for them. So it's not as if احنا فريسة سهلة يعني. It's not like they can just float around on yachts and snap their fingers. Even in the heyday of British and French colonialism, it wasn't. The French fought their way into Damascus 3 times in 30 years. They had to fight their way into Damascus 3 times in 30 years. 1920, 1926, 1945. Not easy to dominate this region. Okay? So you have to take a long perspective to see that. And you have to pull back. We are self-obsessed. We think we're the most important region in the world, and each Arab people, the Palestinians think the world revolves around them. So do the Lebanese. I have a Lebanese mother and a Palestinian father. I can say that. And if you come from Dunya, of course, into Dunya. And the Tawansa feel this, and the Yemenis, and they're all right, of course. But in fact, if you pull the camera back a little bit, just a little bit, you'll see that we're not that different from anybody else. It's just this is a really much more important region than most regions of the world on a number of scales.
هو فقط تنويه أو استكمال على هو امتياز هناك امتياز ملغوم كان للربيع العربي هو كشف الغطاء الأمني أو السياسي عن الحالات التعبير السلفية اللي كانت كامنة على المستويات العامة في المنطقة العربية أتاح لها التنفس لكن في مستوى آخر غير مرئي عادة وأنا أؤكد على الذي قالته الأستاذة هنا حول تحديدا إعادة الربيع تمكين عدد من المجموعات الهشة النساء تحديدا أنا أتحدث من مجتمع قادم إليه من مجتمع قادم منه اليمن مجتمع اليمن محافظ متجهم عادة استطاع أن ينتزع الربيع العربي أو التحول السياسي الذي في المنطقة استطاع أن ينتزع قدر من الاعتراف ما كان غير مسبوق بأدوار قيادية لفئات ضعيفة أو كانت خارج لا تمتلك فرص للحضور في المشهد العام نساء التكوينات الشابة التكوينات المدنية هذا بعد جديد وغير مهم المشكلة الحادثة إنه إعادة تمكين السلفيين الجدد بين قوسين هو إعادة تمكين لفئات مسيطر عليها أمنيا لفترات طويلة والآن تدخل في ظل ارتباطات ذات طابع عميق مع فاعلين دوليين مهمين مثل الولايات المتحدة مثل الفاعل الغربي في إعادة تسوية تحدث تسوية بعيدا عن الغضب عن تعبيرات جهادية لكن هؤلاء أنتجوا تسويات ذكية ومهمة هذه التسوية تأتي على حساب الفئات المدنية الفاعل الذي ظهر مع حالة الربيع العربي في اليمن مثل النساء الذي تم الاعتراف بأدوار قيادية لهن الآن هو في هذه المرحلة هو الطرف الأكثر عرضة للتهديد من قبل التحالف الجديد هذا من قبل السلفيين الذين يحظى مشاركتهم بالسياسة بحالة تسويق غير مسبوقة من قبل الفاعلين الإقليميين من قبل الفاعل الدولي وبالتالي المكاسب الهشة التي تحققت هناك يعني تراجع مخيف فيها بسبب هذه الصيغة التي تتولد في المنطقة أنا آسف على الإطالة وشكرا
أنا هذا تعليق موافق عليه.
We will have a short break and when we meet at 10:30. So we'll have a short break and they will be at 10:30. And those of you who have questions and comments, please keep them, ask them later on today.